Okay, so what you can see here is, first of all, based upon the income quartile, there's a very large difference where people in the lowest quartile are more likely to say government, people in the high quartile are more likely to say free markets. However, if you switch over from the surveyed preferences, remember surveyed, this is what people really said. Simulated is what they would say if they knew what they were talking about. All right, simulated is what they would say if they actually knew what they were talking about. There is a big change here. Right, and in particular, you notice that the change is largest in the lowest income quartile. Okay, so the largest effect is actually largest for the people who had the lowest income, smallest for the people who had the largest income, right? And yet, the direction of the effect was the same. It was the same for all different income groups. So you might think, for example, that people who knew a lot, who knew what they were talking about, but a low income would want to have more government. People who were smart and had who had high income and knew what they were talking about would want to have very little government. The actual pattern was that knowledge worked the same way for every single category, and actually had a larger effect for people who had lower income. Okay? And when you then go and say, so what would the distribution look like if everyone had the highest possible score on the test? It actually shifted from 6238 to 4753, which is interesting because, of course, in a democracy, what do you need in order to get the policy that you want? Generally 51% or 50% plus 1. So this knowledge effect was actually large enough to flip public opinion from one position to the other. Right, now this is just one example. Althouse basically shows that for almost every question you can think of, there are substantial knowledge effects. People who know more generally want different policies than people who know less. Even on questions where you might think there wouldn't be such a large knowledge effect, there almost always is. And again, you may say, isn't this something else? Well, it's not any of the obvious things anyway. It's not income, it's not gender, not race, because these things are all very easy to adjust for. Okay, so again, isn't it possible that it's something that nobody thought of? Yeah, that's always possible. Okay, so for any actual empirical work that's ever been done, isn't it possible that there's some answer that nobody's ever figured out, and therefore you haven't been able to show that it's wrong? Yeah, it's possible. So the way that actual empirical work proceeds is we take suggestions, saying, is there any particular complaint anyone has? Well, if enough people have it and it's cheap enough to do, we'll try it. Otherwise, we'll just continue as we've been doing. Okay. All right, so those are two methods that have been used very widely, and both of which conclude that the miracle aggregation, the key assumption of the miracle aggregation is wrong. People who don't know what they're talking about don't flip a coin. Right? So what do people who don't know what they're talking about do? Well, they tend to gravitate towards certain kinds of wrong beliefs. Okay, so in a way, when you look at the way that people who are uninformed think, it's almost like they have a sixth sense for the truth and then they do the opposite. Okay, so there's some kind of reverse magnetism where if there's a belief that someone who knows a lot, there's a belief that will tend to appeal to someone who knows a lot, it will tend to repulse those who don't know very much. Okay, now we're going to move to the main method that I apply to my book. This is the method of layman-expert comparison. The idea behind this approach is this. Let's see whether laymen and experts systematically disagree, controlling for other factors. Now, the key assumption behind this approach is that when people have studied a subject for a long time think one thing, and people who have never studied the subject think something else, the people who study it for a long time are probably right, and the people who haven't studied it are probably wrong. Okay, so many people have complained that's an elitist assumption. All right, so yes, it is. It is an elitist assumption. However, that does not make it false. In fact, it seems like a very reasonable elitist assumption. And for most fields, we are quite willing to think this. So if a math professor disagrees with a kindergartner about the right solution to a math problem, we generally don't say, maybe the kindergartner's right, let's give the kid a chance. Or you usually say, probably the math professor. And again, if it is a college student and a math professor, normally we think that the professor is likely to be correct. Okay? Now, is the expert always correct? Of course not. Every now and then, experts are wrong. There's a very funny book called The Experts Speak, which is a dictionary of every stupid thing an expert ever said. Okay, so on any subject, you can go and find Albert Einstein and the stupid thing that he had to say about this. Okay, so it happens. Experts do occasionally say things that are stupid. However, I'll point out there is no book called the Dictionary of Amateur called the Amateur Speak. The Amateur Speak, where you would go and get a whole bunch of stupid things that people didn't know what they were talking about said, just wouldn't be that funny. Right? When Albert Einstein says something that's stupid, it's funny. When someone nobody you've ever heard of says something stupid, whatever. Right? Not very interesting. Okay, so the reason the book is funny is not because experts have no reliability, but rather because it goes contrary to our expectations. All right, so the method then is to see whether laymen and experts systematically disagree, controlling for other factors. Right? Controlling for other factors. So very often someone may say, well, of course the experts think this because they have a certain interest in getting a particular kind of answer. Okay, so if that's the story, then let's see whether we can adjust for that. Okay, now the key assumption here, as I said, is if they do, then the experts are probably right and the public is probably wrong. Again, is this absolute proof? No. This is empirical social science, so there's no absolute proof. What we're looking for is high degrees of probability, which, as you may have noticed, is all that we have in real life. Okay, so did you have any absolute proof that on your way over here you would make it here alive? I don't think so. Right? There's always a chance that in your effort to get over here, some horrible accident could befall you. However, this does not mean that it's reasonable to stay in your room for the rest of your life, trying to make sure that nothing happens to you, because it's highly unlikely. You can know with a very high degree of certainty that you can walk across campus safely and get to a lecture, and that's all that you need in real life. In real life, we don't need absolute certainty. Fortunately, because we almost never have it. All right. Now, the results of when you apply this method of layman-expert comparison is that there are large systematic disagreements on important questions. Right? When you compare the views of experts to laymen, there generally turn out to be large differences on important questions, such as systematically biased beliefs about economics. Right now, I'm an economist, so the question of whether or not, or the question of when economists in the public disagree about economics, who's right, that's a particularly interesting question to me. I study the subject. It's, in fact, you could say economics is my life, or much of my life. Right? But I think economics is a very important subject, even if you aren't all that interested in it. I'll just make a few points here. First of all, economics is relevant to almost all modern policy debates. Almost any time people are arguing about a policy, economics has something to say. Right? Certainly when we're talking about should we go and spend $1 trillion to deal with a recession, economics might have something to say about this. Right? Whether or not spending $1 trillion is worth it one way or another, you might want to know something about economics before you say the answer is definitely yes or the answer is definitely no. Okay? But the same goes for lots of other things. For example, there are many economists who work on the subject of crime, and in fact, they do much of the best work on it because economists spend a lot of time trying to figure out ways to figure out whether or not extra punishment is actually causing a reduction in crime or not. Right? So one thing you may notice if you just look at the world is that generally there's in areas with a lot of crime, there's also a lot of police. So you might then conclude that police cause crime, which is possible. Right? Maybe the police are committing the crime. Maybe they're really corrupt. However, another explanation is when there's a lot of crime, people hire a lot of police in order to protect themselves. Okay, so economists have done a lot of work trying to sort this out, figuring out what actually causes what. Okay, so economists will often testify about, say, the effects of the death penalty on the murder rate. Okay, so economics is relevant to most modern policy debates. Now, a second reason why the question of systematically biased beliefs about economics is interesting is that economists have a very long history of complaining about their students. Right, so for hundreds of years, economists have been saying, I can't believe my students think this ridiculous stuff. I spend my entire class trying to fix my students, trying to unscrew their heads and put them on straight. Okay, so that makes it kind of interesting to see, well, have economists been complaining about their students with good reason or without good reason? Okay. All right. Now, if you take a look at a lot of earlier surveys, and there's many that have been done, almost all of them are consistent with systematic bias. The main problem, though, is that even though there's a lot of surveys that ask the public's views about economics, and they ask economists' views about economics, they almost never ask exactly the same question. So it's always open to someone to say, look, it's just a matter of the way that you word the question. If you ask the question in one way, you get one answer. Ask the question another way, you get a different answer. So you can't really show that the reason why economists and the public seem to disagree is because economists know more. Maybe it's just because you asked the question in a different way. Right? Now, when I was studying this question, I said, all right, so how can I actually deal with this? Well, one thing that I could have done would be to commission my own survey, but that costs like $100,000, so not that easy for an assistant professor to get $100,000. So you can look around and say, well, has someone already done all the work for me? And will they then give me the fruits of their labor for free? Possibly. Right, so sometimes that won't work, but actually I lucked out. So it turned out that there was something that was done by some other people called the Survey of Americans and Economists on the Economy, done in 1996. This is the one really big survey where they asked exactly the same questions to both economists and to the general public. Okay, so it was a very diverse set of questions where on the one hand they went and surveyed a random sample of Americans. On the other hand, they surveyed a random sample of PhD economists. And then this allows us to go and compare their answers.